All right, this is the third and final video tutorial or review on imperialism. All right, picking up where we left off, we're now going to move on to China. And if you remember from the first video when I talked about the different types of imperialism, I said the majority of countries were protectorates, which means they had there was indirect control. And I said there was direct control, but that was actually a small minority. Most countries didn't have that. But I also talked about spheres of influence. And if you remember, I tried to explain it to you, but I said, if you don't understand it, don't worry. It's better to see it in context. It's better to explain it when I explain China. So we are here. Take a look at the map on the left. As you can see, China is one country. Yet that one country, if you look at the key, is controlled by multiple countries, right? A chunk of China is controlled by Britain, a chunk by France, a chunk by Germany, a chunk by Japan, a chunk by Russia. All right, this is what we mean by spheres of influence. Now, don't get confused. Remember, during the scramble for Africa, Africa is a continent, and that continent was split up into different countries, and each country was ruled by a different imperial power, right? And those imperial powers, most of them ran those countries as protectorates, some as direct, as colonies with direct control, so on. But China is the exception. China is where you have one country with multiple countries that have, that imperialize. It's been imperialized by multiple countries. And what happens is it's basically the government of China, right? The Qin dynasty of China stays in place. So it's similar to a protectorate in that way, that the Chinese government continues to run the day-to-day operations. However, these imperialist powers each carve a different section of China. And within their section of China, they completely dominate, completely control all the business operations within that area. They have, what's the word for it? They have control over and power over the business operations within their section. If you take a look at the picture on the right, that's a political cartoon of this era, and you think about it, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. The pie is labeled China, basically. I mean, that's the different spelling, but and you can see that this figure standing with his hands up is a racist caricature of a Chinese person, and of course, the Chinese person looks very upset. And the reason why is because all of these people around the table are all carving up China. They're each taking a chunk of China. The woman on at the bottom on the left, that woman represents England. The person next to her, as soon as you see the point on top of his hat, you know that's Germany. Next to him, I think that guy is Russia, if I'm not mistaken. And then next to him is a woman who represents France. And then next to her, the person at the end is, of course, Japan. All right? And so each of them carve out a different chunk of China. Each of these different imperial powers has a sphere of influence. That's what they say, a sphere of influence in China. China is the one country that has spheres of influence. All right, how does imperialism in China work? All right, at the beginning of this, remember, if you remember from 9th grade, you'll remember that China was far more advanced than the European powers for most of its history. For hundreds of years, it was, it had, it developed gunpowder. It was the power that developed block printing. It developed porcelain. It had a complete monopoly on silk. And so many countries in Europe had been trading for China for quite some time. It was all of the countries of Europe were interested in getting their hands on Chinese products. And in fact, China ended up selling more products than it bought. Right? So China would always sell more products than it purchased. So that meant that it gained a lot of money from European powers. European powers were losing a lot of money to China. So with this in mind, Britain approaches China and basically says, listen, we want to start selling you more of our stuff. Because obviously Britain is losing a lot of money to China. And Britain had just had this industrial revolution. It's creating all of these new, very advanced products, and approaches China and says, hey, we'd like you to buy, we'd like to have more trade with you, and so on and so forth. And China basically says, no thanks. We like our situation how it is. We continue to control, we want to control the amount of influence that foreigners have on our country, right? Remember, it's an ethnocentric country. They want to practice isolationism. They do not want foreigners to have a lot of contact with them. They do not want foreigners to influence their culture. They are against cultural diffusion. All right, so they basically say, no thanks, we're not interested in your products. We'd like to continue as is. So Britain is not going to accept that for very long. And so they decide, all right, if you're not interested in our textiles, if you're not interested in our clocks and things like that, we've got something that you're really going to love. Long story short, they start selling opium. Now, if you're familiar with heroin and things like that, that's that same kind of family of drugs. These very, really strong things is opium. And if you see the picture of the guy in the top left with the pipe in his mouth, that's an opium pipe. He is right now smoking opium. So he is getting high as a kite. All right. And so, as we all know in this country, the illegal drug trade it's horrible for a country. It's horrible on a society. Millions of people, like over 1 million people in China are now addicted to opium. And addicts, if you're addicted, it doesn't just affect the addict, right? These are people who can't hold jobs. They are abandoning their family. They're spending all of their money on drugs. They're stealing for drug money, and so on and so forth. It's destroying the culture. So naturally, the government is very upset with this. So they have really strict laws. If you're found selling opium or smuggling opium, they will cut your head off. I mean, this is real serious stuff. But as you might imagine, when there's a buck to be made, when there's a lot of money to be made, people are willing to take, it doesn't matter what the penalty is. People are still going to go forward with this. And addicts are still going to use, and people are still going to sell. And that's what ends up happening. So as much as China is trying to stop the drug trade, they're not having a lot of luck. And they approach the British government. They say, listen, you must stop selling opium in our country. It's too much. You have to stop. And Britain basically ignores them. No, leave me alone. We're making a ton of money. Suddenly, this is a winning formula for Britain. Britain is making a ton of money from the opium trade. So they're like, no, we're not going to stop. So basically, China says, listen, if you don't stop, it's going to be war. And Britain says, bring it. And long story short, that's how you get to the second box, which is the Opium War. And if you can take a look at that picture, that small picture, I don't know if you can tell, on the left is the Chinese boats. The name of these, but they're called junks. You don't need to know that. But what you do need to see is these are more of these very simple traditional sailboats, right? They're powered by wind. They're smaller. These are boats that, they've been using for a very long time. Meanwhile, these boats with their outdated cannons and their very, weak firearms are going up against the British Navy, which if you see on the right, I don't know if you can tell from that picture, they're going against steamships, okay? Like, this is ridiculous. They are completely outmatched. There is no way the Chinese are going to win, and they don't. They get their butts handed to them. They completely lose. So now, so Britain wins the Opium War, and so, naturally, they have to sign a treaty, right? After every war, you have the treaty to end the war. And this is known as the Treaty of Neijing, and you need to know that name. So know the Treaty of Neijing. And basically, obviously, one of the, since China lost, Britain gets to set the terms. So, obviously, Britain is going to be able to continue the drug trade, obviously. But the other things that Britain wins in this treaty is they're going to force the Chinese to keep their ports open to the British. They are going to get Hong Kong, which only recently, that was just a couple of years ago, that China finally gave this back. But for many, many decades, the city of Hong Kong was like a separate British colony inside of China. So it was a separate British territory inside China because they had gained control of that through the Treaty of Neijing, so Hong Kong. They granted British citizens extraterritoriality. All right, you should be familiar with that term. If you ever hear the term extraterritoriality, know that we're talking about imperialism. Long story short, extraterritoriality means that Chinese laws do not apply to British citizens in China. All right, so if a British person breaks the law, the Chinese cops can't go after him. And then finally, obviously, China's got to pay the cost of the war. All right, so with the Treaty of Neijing, with the loss in the Opium War, this is basically the start of imperialism in China. And Britain is the first country. It's certainly not the last. All of these other Western countries get a sphere of influence within China, as we discussed with that map. They have exclusive trade privileges. Oh, that was the expression I was thinking of. The exclusive trade privileges. That means they're the only ones who can do business inside their sphere of influence. Inside their sphere of influence, they're the only ones who can do business. Now, if you remember, I'll go back to this map. As you can see, not all of China is colored in. Some of the areas remained yellow. I didn't write it here, but I really should have. It's don't forget about the open door policy. Open door policy. This was something that came out of America, the U.S. The U.S. said that China must be able to trade with other countries. So even countries like the United States that did not have a sphere of influence in China were able to trade with China. So China was open to trade with the entire world, could not keep them out. So now China is no longer has the option to be isolated and has lost control. The government no longer controls basically business in China. All right, moving forward. What happens is this continues, the Chinese people are very unhappy. All right. There's going to be a series. There's going to be two major rebellions you need to know about. The first one is the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion is actually a rebellion against the government of China, against the Qing government. In the Taiping Rebellion, they find that the government is corrupt. It is very much under the influence of foreign governments. There's a lot of starvation, a lot of economic problems because there's some weather and stuff like that. But long story short, it's a rebellion against the government corruption, and it fails. The Taiping Rebellion is put down. The second rebellion, which is even more important for you to remember, this one is known as the Boxer Rebellion. And whenever you hear the Boxer Rebellion, you should always think of this: death to the foreign devils. That's what the Boxers used to say. And the reason they said this is because the Boxer Rebellion was a rebellion against the foreigners. The Boxers wanted to get the foreigners out of China. That was the whole push. Very often the regents will compare the Boxer Rebellion to the rebellion in India where they wanted to get rid of the British. If you remember, what was the name of that? That would be the Sepoy Rebellion. So very often the Sepoy Rebellion and the Boxer Rebellion are compared because they're both trying to get rid of foreign influence. All right? Okay, so with that, I'm not going to go into this area. I'm not going to talk about it, but suffice to say, even though I've gone over India, I've gone over Africa, I've gone over China, be aware, and a little bit I went over Egypt, but be aware that other parts of the world are also subject to imperialism. Like I said, throughout Southeast Asia, Vietnam and Indochina is conquered by France, Burma is taken over by the British, blah, 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 blah. The Middle East is, Egypt and Iran are also dealing with imperialism. So there is imperialism in other parts of the world during this era, but these are the three countries that you really need to, three areas of the world you need to know about. The continent of Africa, China, and India. All right, one last thing. Another country that we're going to take a look at is Japan. Japan is actually an interesting case. long story short, Japan is going to go from being a target of imperialism to an imperialist power itself. So you may remember I talked about this topic in during the Industrial Revolution, at the end of the Industrial Revolution. So please, if you need to be familiar with this topic, please check that other video. So I'm just going to go over this very briefly. What happens is China and Japan are often compared because they're pretty similar in the fact that both countries practice the policy of isolationism. And because both Japan and China remained isolated, they did not keep up with the pace of change that was going on in Europe. So Europe, at the time that these countries chose a policy of isolationism, both China and Japan were far more advanced scientifically than Europe. But by choosing isolationism, Europe actually moves forward, goes through the Industrial Revolution, and then when these cultures come in contact again, Japan and China have fallen behind, and the Europeans are now much more advanced with regard to technology, especially the technology involved with manufacturing and with war. So they're much more powerful countries. All right, so as I said, what happens in Japan is they're very behind. Matthew Perry from the United States kind of pulls up. He says, listen, you got to trade with us. We want you to trade with us. I'll give you 6 months to think about it. Japan is under the control of the Tokugawa shogunate. Long story short, they know it's a losing proposition to fight. So they say, when the U.S. comes back in a couple months, Matthew Perry comes back, they say, we agree. We will open our doors. We will open ourselves up to trade. So by doing this, the government is able to have a much stronger role in controlling the country. It's not completely dominated the way China was. And so what Japan is able to do is, as they gain contact with the Europeans, unlike China, which tried to hold on to its traditional culture and really went into industrialization kicking and screaming, Japan embraces industrialization and embraces modernization. And this is during this period of the Meiji Restoration. So if you see the pictures at the top, they go from being a culture that was very traditional with samurai warriors and, women in traditional dress and, having very traditional roles in society and, very limited technology. During this period of the Meiji Restoration, it's a period of rapid industrialization. The country modernizes. It becomes more Western. It adopts much more advanced technology, so on and so forth. What's important about this is due to the Meiji Restoration, due to this rapid industrialization, if you remember from when we looked at England, we said the 3 biggest reasons why England was able to industrialize and why England was the first country to industrialize. If you remember, the 3 biggest reasons are it had lots of food because of the agricultural revolution, it had lots of workers, and the last one was it had lots of raw materials. Unfortunately for Japan, they've only got 2 out of the 3. Although it has a large population, it does not, remember, Japan is a very small island. It's a volcanic island, very little flat land. The only food that it is self-sufficient with is rice, okay? And then it has to fish also. It has access to fish and has rice that it can grow. But other than that, it has to import food, so it doesn't have a large food supply, and it does not have a lot of raw materials. And that's something that Japan continues to struggle with today. So because of that, for Japan to be able to industrialize, it must imperialize. Remember, for Japan must imperialize to industrialize. Japan must imperialize to industrialize because it lacks raw materials and farmland. So Japan is going to start, like I said, it went from a target to imperialism to an imperialist power. As you can see, it goes to war against China, takes over a chunk of China. That way it gets a foothold on the mainland, making it easier for them to have markets and so on. It ends up taking on Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, which was a big turning point because Russia was one of the European powers. It was considered this, very strong nation. And here, this pipsqueak Japan that nobody really gave much focus to suddenly is able to beat Russia in a war. And people said, whoa, we've got an emerging global threat. These guys are now a threat. They are a new power in the world. And then later, Japan is also going to take over Korea, annex Korea. The only thing, and I think, again, I mentioned this in the previous slide, I want to mention it here, is that the war between Japan and China and its possession of Korea, that is going to continue in the midst, after this Meiji restoration. It is going to continue. Japan's imperialism is going to continue. It starts before World War II, but what happens is in the midst of World War II, this will merge into it. So Japan starts attacking other countries as part of imperialism. It will sign an agreement with Hitler and Mussolini, and it will join their side in World War II. And during World War II, it continues to take over nations in Asia. All right? Last thing, and then we're done with the topic. Frequently, a big topic for DBQ and thematic essays is the topic of the pros and cons of imperialism and what's good and bad about it. Most students don't have an issue coming up with some bad stuff. It's pretty straightforward. Obviously, this is, you have all the racism stuff about, the white man's burden, and that they're going to destroy the local culture, and they're going to exploit the workers, and they're taking all of the raw materials out of the country. And, these countries that instead of doing what they want to do, their whole economy is based on working with Europe, serving Europe, providing Europe with raw materials. So their whole economy is based on this relationship with Europe. So even after they get to be independent, this still has kind of long-term impacts for the health of their economies, because their whole country is set up to provide raw materials to others, as opposed to having manufacturing and businesses internally. The destruction of local culture, the destruction of the religions, because a big push for the imperialists was to spread Christianity. There's famines due to this cash crops, because they're constantly growing food for export and not producing enough food for people to eat. And then, in Africa, you can talk about artificial borders, the ethnic tensions in India and in Africa and other places that are stirred up because of that. If you remember, we discussed divide and rule, all of that. Okay, so on and so forth. All right, so the cons are pretty simple. There are some pros, however. There's kind of a silver lining on the cloud, all right? And basically the argument is that imperialists did make some positive changes. One change that the imperialists made is when they come into a country, they create infrastructure. Okay, if you don't know what that means, infrastructure, that means it's the structures. I'm trying to define the word without using the word. Infrastructure is like all of the things you need to build to make a country work. So what do I mean? Infrastructure are things like bridges and roads and a post office and schools and highways. These are the structures, the things you need to build to make society work. Like if the nail salon down the block stops working, they go out of business, or the pizza parlor shuts down, life will go on. You get what I'm saying? But if all the schools are gone, if the roads are gone, if all the bridges get knocked down, society will stop functioning. Okay, that helps. So that's what infrastructure means. And it is the imperialists who come in and create infrastructure. They're the ones who are going to build roads. They're going to build railroads. They're going to build telegraph systems, postal systems, irrigation systems, all of these structures. And they're going to build it in the countries they imperialize. So even after the countries become independent, these structures, this infrastructure stays behind so that the independent countries can use it. Now, don't get it wrong. This infrastructure was not built to help the local people. The reason why the imperialists built railroads was to be able to get the raw materials out of the country and to ship the goods that they wanted to sell into the country, right? So they were using it and set them up for their own purposes. Irrigation, they wanted water to go to the crops. Why? Because they were forcing these people to grow cash crops. It was in their interest to develop irrigation systems. They weren't, they weren't doing it to be nice guys. Nonetheless, it does have a positive impact on the countries. You can take a look at the new laws. I mean, you can make the argument, oh, how dare Western countries impose their culture on the natives. By the same token, it's hard to look at Africa and think, well, the Europeans made slavery illegal. How evil of them. Yeah, no, you know what I mean? Like, take a look. There's something known as sati. Sati is this Hindu belief that, hold on a second. I'm just recording the thing. Okay. Sati is a belief that when a Hindu wife, when her husband dies, she's supposed to throw herself on the husband's funeral pyre. They make the caste system illegal so that there can't be prejudice against untouchables. All of these. And, true, it was like Westerners imposing their culture, but I don't know, I don't know, as a woman, can I argue with, yeah, I think it is I don't think women should burn themselves to death when their husband dies. Sorry. I'm a snobby Westerner. What can I say? There were British schools that opened. This was definitely big in India, not as much in Africa, but certainly the Indians in Britain, many of them got a Western education. For example, Gandhi. Gandhi went to British schools and was British educated, and he was able to use that knowledge to help his country become independent. The biggest thing, I'd say that one of the biggest positive impacts that the Imperials has were the improvements in healthcare. So things like opening hospitals, vaccines, making vaccines available. In addition, they're going to improve sanitation. There's going to be better, there's another word for that, like keeping people clean, like, access to fresh water, things like that. These kind of structures, what they find is that this allows for life expectancy in the colonies is going to go up. All right, with that, sorry about the interruption. All right, I'm going to leave it at that because I'm too tired to record this again. All right, so the next video will be on World War I. Thanks for watching.